He arrived at the
Sir,
Veterans
I'm afraid
Hall
you can't
in
go
his
in.
full Army dress uniform,
There seems to be a problem
medals
with your
shining
credentials.
proudly on his chest. But instead of honor, he was stopped at the very doors, denied the right to enter among his brothers. At home, the old soldier sat alone at his kitchen table, medals scattered like forgotten relics, his head heavy in his hands as despair closed in. In court, his trembling voice told the story of jungles, fire, and the blood
I
he
swear
had
to
shed,
tell the truth,
while his lawyer
the
laid
whole
out
truth,
every proof of his
and
service.
nothing but the truth.
Justice answered at last, and the hall's doors opened
We are
wide
honored by
this
your
time,
presence, sir.
not to reject him, but to welcome him with applause and salutes. Standing at the podium, his medals
It is an
catching the
honor
light,
to stand
his
before
words
you
rang
today,
clear. Honor
to remember
denied
the
can be
sacrifices
delayed,
made.
but never destroyed. The town's Veterans Hall stood tall and proud at the corner of Main Street, its brick walls lined with flags, its doors heavy with the weight of history. To most, it was a place of honor, a sanctuary where men and women who had worn the uniform could gather, share stories, and remember the past. But for Charles Henderson, a 75-year-old Vietnam veteran, that hall represented something deeper: recognition, belonging, and the dignity that had been denied him for far too long. On the day of the annual ceremony, Charles arrived early. He wore his army dress uniform, pressed and spotless despite the years. His medals glinted faintly under the morning sun, each one telling a story of sacrifice and survival. His posture, though slowed by age, was still straight, his boots polished until they reflected the light. Neighbors who saw him walk toward the hall whispered admiration. He looked every bit the soldier he had once been. But as Charles reached the front steps, he noticed the shift in the atmosphere. Two men in blazers, with the Veterans Hall insignia, approached, their expressions stern. One held a clipboard, scanning the list, as though looking for a name he already knew would not be there. "I'm sorry, sir," the man said curtly, blocking Charles's path. "You're not on the list. This event is for members only." Charles frowned, adjusting the medals on his chest. "I served in '69, he said calmly, his voice steady but firm. "I bled for this country. I've earned my place here." A ripple of discomfort passed through the small crowd gathered nearby. Some veterans shifted uneasily, but no one spoke up. The second man stepped forward, shaking his head. "I'm afraid you'll have to leave." His words carried no sympathy, only finality. The humiliation struck harder than any wound Charles had ever received in battle. Standing there, in full uniform, medals pinned proudly to his chest, he felt stripped bare, as though his sacrifice meant nothing. Murmurs rose among the onlookers. A few whispered support, but more watched in silence, unwilling to intervene. With a slow breath, Charles turned away. Each step back down those stairs felt heavier than the last. The building that should have welcomed him as a brother had become a fortress, shutting him out. By the time he reached the sidewalk, his eyes burned not from anger, but from the deep, familiar ache of being forgotten. That morning, Charles Henderson walked home alone. His back remained straight, but inside, his spirit carried the weight of a nation that had once asked for his courage, only to deny him the respect he had earned. When Charles Henderson returned home that evening, the silence of his small living room felt louder than the rejection he had endured. He unbuttoned his army dress uniform slowly, as if each snap and clasp carried the weight of decades. The medals on his chest, once shining symbols of valor, now felt hollow. He laid them carefully on the table, his hand trembling. In the mirror across the room, he caught his own reflection, an old man in uniform, eyes tired and wet. He hardly recognized himself. Memories began to flood back, uninvited but unstoppable. He remembered the blistering heat of Vietnam, the mud caked on boots, the faces of brothers who never made it home. He remembered the letters he had carried in his pocket, unsent promises to loved ones waiting across the ocean. He had done his duty, faced the fire, and borne scars that never fully healed. And yet here he was turned away, treated like a stranger by the very people who should have stood beside him. The days that followed blurred together in quiet despair. Charles avoided walking past the Veterans Hall. Each time he saw its flag fluttering, it felt like a reminder that he was not welcome. Neighbors tried to comfort him, one brought a casserole, another left a note of encouragement, but he could see pity in their eyes, and pity only deepened the wound. At night, he sat at his kitchen table, sifting through old military papers and photographs. The proof of his service was there. Discharge papers, commendations, snapshots of a young soldier with fire in his eyes. But when he had tried presenting them before, the committee had always found excuses. "We don't have the right records," they would say. Or, "Membership is closed this year." He knew the truth: they didn't want him because of the color of his skin. One evening, as he folded his uniform back into its protective case, Charles muttered aloud, "Was it all for nothing?" His voice cracked in the empty room, echoing like a cry unheard. For decades, he had carried the belief that service and sacrifice guaranteed respect. Now that belief crumbled. He felt abandoned not just by the hall, but by the nation he had given so much for. There were moments he considered giving up the fight. He thought about quietly fading into the background, living out the rest of his days with dignity but without recognition. But every time he looked at the medals on his table, he remembered the men who had fallen beside him. They had not fought for nothing. And if he allowed his service to be erased, it would be as though theirs had never mattered either. Still, the pain lingered. Weeks passed, each one heavier than the last. The community went on with its events and gatherings, and Charles remained on the outside, looking in. He was a soldier without a unit, a veteran without a hall, a man who had been asked to give everything and yet denied the simple honor of belonging. In those dark days, Charles Henderson sat alone, wrestling with the cruel irony of his life. He had survived war, but the deepest wound came not from battle, but from being told he did not belong. It was on one of those heavy afternoons, when Charles sat on his porch staring at the folded uniform in its case, that a knock came at the door. A young man stood there, neatly dressed, carrying a briefcase. He introduced himself as Daniel Brooks, a local attorney and the son of a veteran. Daniel had read about Charles's rejection in a small community paper and had tracked him down. "Mr. Henderson," Daniel said gently, "my father served in Vietnam too. He always told me the greatest injustice is to forget the ones who stood beside us. I want to help you." Charles looked at him skeptically. Lawyers had never been part of his world, but there was something earnest in Daniel's eyes, something that reminded him of the brothers he had once trusted with his life. After a long pause, he nodded. "What can you do for an old man like me?" Daniel set his briefcase on the table and opened it. "We build a case. You have your discharge papers, your medals, photographs, testimonies. We prove that you served, and we prove that the hall denied you without cause. Then, we take it to court." The idea felt almost impossible. Charles had never imagined fighting for his dignity in front of a judge. But as Daniel explained, something inside him stirred. For the first time in months, he felt the faint spark of hope. Over the following weeks, the two men worked tirelessly. Charles dug through boxes of old documents, carefully preserved for decades, yellowed letters from commanding officers, commendation certificates, even a photo of himself standing proudly beside his unit in 1969. Each piece of paper was a reminder of who he was and why he deserved recognition. Daniel gathered witness statements too. A few surviving members of Charles's platoon wrote letters affirming his service, describing his bravery under fire. One recounted how Charles had pulled a wounded soldier to safety while bullets tore through the jungle. Another wrote simply, "He was our brother. He belongs." When the day of the hearing came, Charles wore his uniform again. This time, he stood not before closed doors, but in a courtroom filled with quiet tension. The hall's representatives sat stiffly at one table, arms crossed, while Daniel and Charles sat at the other. The judge, a stern woman with silver hair, called the case. Daniel rose, his voice clear. He presented the evidence papers, photographs, letters, laying them carefully before the court. "Your Honor," he said firmly, "the question before us is not whether Mr. Henderson served. The evidence is undeniable. The question is whether we as a community have the right to deny honor to a man who gave everything for his country simply because of prejudice." Then Charles took the stand. His hands shook as he raised them to swear in, but his voice, though cracked with age, carried the weight of truth. He spoke of the jungles of Vietnam, of nights spent under fire, of men he had carried on his back when they could not walk themselves. He spoke of the day he returned home, only to face cold stares instead of parades. And finally, he spoke of the humiliation of being turned away at the doors of the Veterans Hall. Tears welled in his eyes as he said, "I never wanted a parade. I never wanted applause. All I wanted was to stand with my brothers, to be remembered as one of them. But they told me I didn't belong. After everything, they told me I didn't belong." The courtroom fell silent. Even some of the hall's representatives shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet his gaze. Daniel closed his case with words that struck the heart. "If we deny him, then we deny every soldier who fought beside him. To strip one man of honor is to strip it from us all. And that is a wound our country cannot afford." The judge leaned back, her eyes heavy with thought. Then she spoke, her voice firm but compassionate. "This court finds that Mr. Charles Henderson is, without question, a veteran of the United States Army. The Veterans Hall is hereby ordered to recognize his service and grant him full membership immediately." Charles's breath caught in his chest. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Then his shoulders shook, and tears rolled down his cheeks. The weight of years of silence, rejection, and humiliation lifted. At last, justice had spoken. The morning of his return to the Veterans Hall dawned crisp and cool, sunlight glinting off the flagpole that towered above the brick building. Charles Henderson stood at the bottom of the steps, his army dress uniform perfectly pressed, his medals gleaming once more on his chest. But this time, his stride carried a different weight. He was no longer knocking at a door that refused him. He was walking through a door that justice had ordered open. A hush fell over the crowd as he approached. Dozens had gathered to witness what would happen. Townspeople, fellow veterans, even those who had once turned him away. Some shifted uneasily, unable to meet his eyes. Others nodded quietly, acknowledging the wrong that had been done. At the top of the steps, the same two men who had once blocked his path now stood waiting. Their expressions were stiff, their posture formal, but instead of crossing their arms, they stepped aside. One of them muttered, almost inaudibly, "Welcome, Mr. Henderson." Charles paused only a moment before climbing the final steps. Each footfall echoed not just in the hall, but in his heart. When the heavy doors opened, he crossed the threshold with his head high, shoulders square, like the soldier he had always been. Inside, the air smelled faintly of polished wood and old banners. Rows of chairs were filled with veterans, many in uniforms of different eras. As Charles walked down the aisle, the MC's voice rang out. "Please welcome, for the first time, Sergeant Charles Henderson, Vietnam veteran." The words struck him like thunder. For years he had been invisible, unacknowledged. Now, in this hall that had once rejected him, his name was spoken with honor. Applause broke out. It wasn't hesitant, it was strong, rolling, and sincere. Some veterans stood to their feet, saluting as he passed. Charles's vision blurred, but he kept moving until he reached the front row. After the ceremony began, the MC recited names of the fallen, as was tradition. Charles bowed his head, whispering silent prayers for the brothers he had lost. And when his name was finally added to the roll of those recognized in the hall, a great weight lifted from his chest. During a break, several older veterans approached him. One man, his hair white and his eyes tired, extended a trembling hand. "I was wrong," he said softly. "I should have spoken up before. I'm sorry, brother." Another stepped forward, gripping Charles by the shoulders before pulling him into a hug. "You belong here. You always did." Charles held their gazes, his own eyes wet with tears. He didn't answer with anger or bitterness. Instead, he said the words that had carried him through war and rejection alike. "We never leave a man behind." For the first time in decades, Charles sat in that hall not as an outcast, but as one of them. The banners overhead, the medals on his chest, the flag that hung proudly above it all, felt right. Not as a gift, not as charity, but as a truth finally restored. In that moment, surrounded by men and women who understood the cost of service, Charles Henderson knew that justice was not just a word on paper. It was alive in every handshake, every salute, every tear that fell inside that hall. When the ceremony drew to a close, the hall fell into a reverent silence. The MC invited Charles Henderson to the podium. His steps were slow but steady, the sound of his polished boots echoing against the wooden floor. He gripped the edges of the lectern, scanning the faces before him, some proud, some remorseful, all waiting. His voice, though weathered by age, carried the clarity of conviction. "I never came here for applause," he began, pausing as the room leaned in. "I never asked for titles or favors. All I ever wanted was to stand shoulder to shoulder with those who wore the uniform, and to know that my service mattered." He took a breath, eyes glistening. "The firefights in Vietnam didn't break me. The long nights overseas didn't break me. But being told that I did not belong, that cut deeper than any wound." His words trembled, and several veterans lowered their heads. Then his tone strengthened. "But today, justice has spoken. Today I stand here not just for myself, but for every man and woman who has ever felt forgotten. Our sacrifices cannot be erased. Our honor cannot be denied. Because the truth is simple. Once a soldier, always a soldier." Applause thundered through the hall, echoing against the rafters. Veterans rose to their feet, saluting. Some had tears streaming down their faces. For the first time, Charles's name was not whispered in pity or ignored in silence. It was celebrated, honored, embraced. Afterward, Charles sat among the rows of his fellow veterans. For the first time, he felt the weight of belonging settle warmly on his shoulders. Above them, the American flag hung in solemn dignity, its colors bright against the hall's wooden beams. As he gazed up at it, Charles whispered softly to himself, almost like a prayer. It was worth it. Not because the battle was easy, but because the principle was worth defending, that no sacrifice should be forgotten, and no veteran should ever be left standing alone at a closed door. And with that, the hall that had once rejected him became the place where his honor was restored. His journey had been long and painful, but now, in the eyes of his community and his country, Charles Henderson was finally where he belonged.